The idea of the fall of the Roman Empire has a ring of destiny about it. When we tack on the other half of Edward Gibbon's famous title and consider decline and fall together, it seems downright inevitable. In some existential sense, it was always going to happen. No empire lasts forever, from Old Kingdom Egypt to the Soviet Union. There's always an expiration date. There are always too many internal contradictions, too many forces pulling the periphery away from the center. Rome was no exception. But to understand that no empire survives forever isn't a satisfactory explanation for why the Roman Empire fell apart at the exact time or in the exact fashion that it eventually did. Why not 50 or 200 or 500 years before? Why were barbarian armies forged within the Roman Empire the basis of its successor states rather than local aristocrats or organized invaders from across the border? In other words, how might things have gone differently? There's a corollary to this that we have to bear in mind. It's an absolute miracle that the Roman Empire lasted as long as it did. It's incredible that for so many centuries, faced with so many challenges, and under so many different conditions, it was able to overcome the obstacles it faced to retain something like unity. The factors that created that unity are just as worthy of discussion as what led to its end, and explaining the latter requires understanding the former as well. Back in May, I interviewed the Stanford historian and classicist Walter Scheidel, one of the best big-picture thinkers working on this and related topics. If you haven't listened to that interview, I recommend that you go back and do it, because it was awesome. In the course of our discussion, Professor Scheidel talked at length about the usefulness of considering We're going to think about how and why things might have gone differently, about why the things that had held the Roman Empire together eventually ceased to do so. We're going to spitball a little bit and think out loud, be a little more informal and speculate about these things. Let's step outside what actually went down and think instead about the possibilities that didn't. I think this exercise will tell us a lot about how and why things eventually happened the way that they did. I'm Patrick, and try to take the idea that the end of the Roman Empire didn't have to happen as it did seriously. It could have happened earlier, or later, or maybe even not at all. Grappling with all this is going to help us understand why it did in fact go down as it did, in the manner it did, in the 5th century. So let's start with the basics. At what other points could the Roman Empire have conceivably fallen apart, and why didn't it? There are a ton of possibilities that we could discuss, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries when usurpations were common. They were more the norm in that time than exceptions to the norm, actually. When given a choice, reigning emperors always dealt with usurpers first and left marauding barbarians for later. On a fundamental level, challenges that fit within the framework of the existing system, usurpations, were more dangerous than those that might torch regions, but which left the political structures and allegiances intact. These uprisings might last for years. They can involve whole provinces, entire frontier armies. Literally dozens of incidents fall into this category of usurpations, from Galba in 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors, to the Constantine III who crossed from Britain to Gaul in 406. We've talked about him a few times. There's a good case to be made that imperial unity was actually the exception rather than the rule throughout much of the empire's existence. While there were a couple of stretches of unbroken peace, like the one that lasted through much of the 2nd century, practically every emperor from Marcus Aurelius onward had to deal with at least one usurper. The crisis of the 3rd century, that 50-year period from 235 to Diocletian's rise in 284, was rife with them. Even powerful emperors like Constantine and Theodosius in the 4th century had to deal with at least one rival. The point is, there were always forces trying to split the Roman Empire apart at the seams, and those forces were often channeled through the person of the imperial usurpers. Viewing the Roman Empire as a natural thing, as something that had to exist, is deeply misleading. In fact, holding together a political unit that stretched from Mesopotamia to Britain and from the North Sea to the Sahara was a profoundly unnatural thing. Each of those regions was oriented in different directions, had different environmental conditions, and had its own underlying political, social, and cultural conditions onto which Rome grafted its own practices and institutions. It's a miracle the whole thing ever came together in the first place, much less that it stayed that way for any significant amount of time. With all of that said, I see two real contenders for a potential breakup. The first was in the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, when Octavian, the future Augustus, Mark Antony, and Lepidus divided up the territory controlled by the Republic among the three of them. We call this the Second Triumvirate. The second, some 300 years later, was during the crisis of the 3rd century, when for a brief while there were three separate Roman empires. There was a Gallic Empire that loosely included Britain and Spain, another splinter state centered around Palmyra in the Syrian desert, and then the rump of the central Roman state. Shout out to Palmyra, unfortunately much of which has been destroyed by ISIS in the last few years. It's a dang shame, a truly evil act. Back to business here. In both of those cases that I just mentioned, the Roman Empire literally splintered. It broke up. There was no inherent reason why it had to come back together in the aftermath, no destiny that said the empire had to remain whole until this designated point in the 5th century. But why did it come back together? What pulled it back from the brink? Let's break these two things down. The end of the Roman Republic could and should be a whole show in its own right. Maybe someday we'll go down that road. The high points, though, are these. In the century after the murder of the reformer Tiberius Gracchus by a mob of senators in 133 BC, the Republic's political structures bent and finally broke altogether. There were a number of reasons for this. The pressure of constant war, almost unbelievable, out-of-control economic inequality between rich and poor, and the contradictions inherent in trying to run an empire that spanned the Mediterranean with institutions that had been designed, pretty well, in fact, to run a city-state. These deep issues culminated first in the Social War, the catastrophic rebellion of Rome's Italian allies against the city's overlordship of the peninsula. Next, civil war broke out, from which the general Sulla emerged victorious. Dozens of senators and their supporters were murdered, and in the aftermath, a new kind of normal managed to emerge. It didn't hold, though, and by the 50s BC, the emergence of strongmen like Crassus, Pompey, and of course, Julius Caesar, drastically strained the system even more. Another round of civil war put Caesar in charge until his assassination in 44 BC, and it was in the aftermath of his death that his great-nephew Octavian, the future Augustus, divided up Rome's territory with the famous Mark Antony and with the somewhat forgotten Lepidus. Under this arrangement, Lepidus received Africa, Octavian the provinces of the west, and Antony those of the east, with a strong assist from Cleopatra in Egypt. We know how all this turned out. Lepidus sidelined, Octavian victorious at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra dead by their own hands in Alexandria. Now, it's entirely possible that the conflicts between the members of this second triumvirate were just inevitable, that there was just no way for the three of them to peaceably split the Mediterranean between them. I'm on board with that. But let's embrace our hypotheticals here. What if Antony and Octavian, let's forget about Lepidus here, had found a way to peacefully coexist? Or more likely, what if Antony had defeated Octavian and contented himself with ruling the east from Alexandria in partnership with Cleopatra, thereby splitting the Mediterranean in two? If we're being honest about it, that latter scenario seemed far more likely than what actually ended up happening. Octavian was an inexperienced military commander. Antony had decades of experience, far more resources. Now, some parts of the eastern Mediterranean had been part of Rome's territory for some time, like Greece, for about a century by this point, but other parts had only been recently conquered or were controlled only as client kingdoms rather than directly from Rome. The ties that bound those places to Rome were at this point weak and mostly pretty new. There's no reason they couldn't have instead been directed to a dynasty of Antony and Cleopatra resident in Alexandria rather than to a distant, foreign Rome. On top of that, the East's traditions of rulership were drastically different than those that were prevailing in Rome. This was the Hellenistic world, the world that had grown out of Alexander the Great's conquests 3 centuries beforehand. Antony and Cleopatra, herself a monarch of a Hellenistic dynasty, the Ptolemies, were clearly operating in that tradition. There's no reason why Antony couldn't have easily slipped into it. How many generations would it have taken to completely sever the ties between Syria and Rome, and establish them just as, or more strongly, between Syria and Alexandria? 1? 2? Point being, there was nothing in 35 BC that said the eastern provinces and client kingdoms had to remain connected to Rome forever. It was only the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra and the ruthless extermination of their nascent dynasty that made Octavian, again soon to be Augustus, the default choice. Even then, it took decades, centuries, to tightly bind the East into the Roman Empire. For that matter, imagine someone less capable than Augustus turned out to be the one who emerged from that civil war. Gaul had only been conquered 30 years before. Much of Spain was barely assimilated. It's easy to foresee a situation in which the various pieces of the West went their separate ways in the absence of forceful, competent central authority. But that didn't happen. Instead, Augustus inaugurated a new order. He drew the constitutional prerogatives of the old republican magistracies into the person of the emperor, made it a dynastic position. He co-opted the Senate and the Roman aristocracy to govern this empire. The imperial household and its few hundred highly educated slaves and legal experts formed the core of a tiny but efficient central government. The army had been at the root of the problems of the Civil War years, more loyal to their generals than to the state. Augustus placated the troops with regular pay, bonuses, and generous retirement packages. Slowly but surely, the provinces became more, Roman. There's a huge scholarly literature on the question of quote-unquote Romanization, but suffice to say that the provinces and the center became more homogeneous and culturally and economically integrated. Local elites from Antioch to Alexandria to Athens to Tarragona to Paris were all eventually, not necessarily all at once or quickly, they were all drawn into the web of power and authority that this new Roman Empire wove. Authority transferred relatively smoothly from dynast to dynast within this extended Julio-Claudian family until Nero's death and then the year of the four emperors in 69 AD. By that point, the system was strongly established enough to withstand the shock of a civil war. This was what it took to create a coherent Roman Empire and knit the various pieces together after 2 decades of Mediterranean-wide chaos. It was a fundamental transformation of the political system. It wouldn't really have been all that surprising if the Roman Empire had broken up almost as it was born in the aftermath of Caesar's death and the attendant civil wars. That was, after all, more or less what had happened to Alexander the Great's empire, and never before had any single entity succeeded in ruling the entire Mediterranean. By the 3rd century AD, though, the Roman Empire had been in charge for a couple of centuries. The 2nd century had been the height of Rome's wealth, population, and power. And outside of the reign of Commodus and the brief civil war that followed, things had been more or less stable. The Constitutio Antoniniana, also known as the Edict of Caracalla, had granted Roman citizenship to the entire population of the empire in 212. There were a few signs of problems, though. Plague had reduced the population, the army was restive, constantly demanding more and higher bonuses, and debasement of the coinage was becoming a real economic issue. There had been civil war and usurpation briefly before Septimius Severus had restored order in 193. That state of affairs more or less lasted until 235, when the Emperor Severus Alexander was murdered by his soldiers along the Rhine. This marked the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, which lasted from 235 to 284. The crisis was, at heart, a crisis of imperial legitimacy. Everything else, from extreme debasement of the currency to military shortcomings to the barbarian incursions that characterized those 50 years, grew out of that one core problem. The cycle went like this. Ambitious general on the frontier has an army that's unhappy with its pay or its conditions of service. That army declares its general emperor. The usurper marches away from the frontier with his army to fight the current emperor. Barbarians raid and invade across the now empty border. The usurper wins, but to pay the army, he has to debase the coinage. Another frontier army is unhappy with its pay and debased coinage, declares its general emperor, and so on ad infinitum for half a century. What exactly was stopping the frontier armies from doing this before the crisis of the 3rd century, and what would stop them afterward? In a word, legitimacy. That's not to say it never happened. It absolutely did, both before and after. But there was no real question that Hadrian was supposed to be in charge, or that Constantine the Great was owed obedience and respect. Part of that was their own competence at crushing rivals, especially Constantine, but there was also a basic level of belief that the person at the top of the system was legitimate. That in itself fended off potential challengers before they got started, just as it does in established sovereign states today. With assassination after assassination, and usurpation after usurpation during the crisis of the 3rd century, there was nothing to separate whoever happened to be emperor that week from every other potential rival in the empire. It was like a snowball rolling downhill and picking up momentum with every new usurpation and assassination, creating a feedback loop that just made things worse and worse and worse. As short-lived emperor followed short-lived emperor, it became harder and harder to put in place the foundations for the kind of rule that could build legitimacy over time. Augustus had done that, but it took the combination of war weariness and time to make it work. So did Vespasian, who emerged victorious from the year of 4 emperors in 69 AD and reigned for a decade afterward. Nobody had that kind of time during the crisis of the 3rd century. A few emperors managed to string together several years of rule. Gordian III was in charge for 6 years, but he'd come to the throne as a 13-year-old. Philip the Arab lasted 5 miserable years and Valerian 7, though the latter ruled with his son Gallienus. Gallienus technically ruled for 15 years, but 7 of that was with his father, and his rule suffered from constant usurpations. One count puts the total at 12 after 260 AD, including one that created a whole separate Gallic empire in the west. By 268, central authority had reached a breaking point. Gaul and Britain, and Spain as well, had slipped the bonds of the Emperor Gallienus' authority and formed what historians call the Gallic Empire under the leadership of a separate emperor, Postumus. The East, too, was slipping away under the leadership of the desert trading city of Palmyra, first under its king Odenathus, and then under his wife, the formidable Zenobia. By 270, Zenobia and her generals had pried away huge swaths of the eastern provinces, from Egypt to Syria to Cappadocia and what's now Turkey. This was the highly urbanized, agriculturally productive, and exceptionally rich heartland of the East, not a marginal frontier province or two. So let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of someone looking at this situation in roughly 270. The short-lived emperor Claudius Gothicus had managed to win back Spain before his death, but Gaul and Britain were still separate, as they'd been for a decade already. There was no reason to think that Spain might not be lost again with Claudius Gothicus dead. The wealthy East was on its way to becoming a separate political unit. There were invading barbarians as far south as Italy, and the defenses of the Danube frontier had effectively ceased to exist. The economy was a wreck due to demographic losses from plague and war, rampant currency debasement, and political instability. So, if we're being realistic about it, what about this situation pointed to the inevitable reunion of the Roman Empire under a single ruler? For every Claudius Gothicus, competent but dead too soon, there had been a disaster like Gallienus or Philip the Arab. Worse, there had been Gallienus' father Valerian, captured in battle and forced to live out his days as a footstool, literally, for the Persian king Shapur before he eventually died, when his corpse was skinned, stuffed with straw, and kept as a trophy at the Persian court. There was no guarantee that a seriously competent emperor would come along to deal with the empire's pressing issues, from barbarians to separatists to the economy. Given another decade or two, the gaps between those emerging regions of the empire, those separate empires, might grow so wide as to be irreparable. But somebody competent did come along, Aurelian, who would probably be counted among the all-time great emperors if he hadn't been prematurely assassinated in 275. During his 5-year reign, Aurelian drove out the barbarians, secured the frontier, defeated the Palmyrines in the east, and took back Gaul in the west. He even tried to reform the coinage. Even so, Aurelian only lasted 5 years on the throne. That's as telling an indication of just how broken the empire's political system was at that point as anything you could find. Even an incredibly competent emperor who had done all of these things couldn't muster up the legitimacy to fend off an assassination. It took another decade after Aurelian's death for Diocletian to come along and put into place a series of fundamental reforms to fix the myriad issues that had contributed to the crisis of the 3rd century. What if an Aurelian or a Diocletian hadn't come along? Or if they'd been assassinated early in their reigns like so many others in the crisis of the 3rd century? What if the successors to the great Postumus as ruler of the Gallic Empire had been better? Things might have turned out very, very differently. So, what did it take for first Aurelian and then, more importantly, Diocletian to pull the empire back together? It was wholesale structural shifts. Diocletian reformed the coinage and the tax system. He expanded the army and rebuilt the frontiers. He put into place a new system that increased the number of provinces and drew up formal administrative hierarchies. The enormous civil bureaucracy that administered the provinces and the complex, deep system of taxation that made the whole thing function was Diocletian's brainchild. He took on imperial colleagues and appointed subordinates to get around the problem of usurpations and power sharing. The emperor was made distant by court ceremony and ritual. It was harder to assassinate him, harder to get at him. All of this was an effort to fix the problem of legitimacy that had so plagued the system for the past 5 decades. You could have been born in the 230s and died, living your whole life during the crisis of the 3rd century, if you died before 285. In essence, Diocletian created a more militarized, authoritarian Roman Empire. He, his predecessors, and his new colleagues in this imperial system, they'd all been soldiers, raised in the harsh discipline of the army. And they brought that outlook with them to the new state that they created. Some of this had been percolating for a while, like army reforms, but other pieces of it were new inventions. Even so, despite all of this, it still took 20 years of not always successful rule for Diocletian to do this. He still had to fight usurpers and rivals the whole time. Parts of the system broke down immediately after he abdicated in 305. The power-sharing arrangements among co-emperors, what we call the tetrarchy, was dead within a year. For the most part, though, the system that Diocletian put into place was the one that endured up to the end of the empire. Each of these two cases, the end of the Republic and the crisis of the 3rd century, was transformative. In real ways, both saw the end of the prior system and the beginning of something fundamentally new. Not disconnected from the past, but a transformation on a real basic level of the old state of affairs into a new political arrangement. Augustus and Diocletian had the means and the opportunity to oversee real structural shifts in how the Roman Empire functioned. Both ruled long enough to be sure that those changes stuck. So that was what it took to pull the Roman Empire back from the brink. Real, deep, structural changes in how the political system functioned. Augustus and Diocletian, and more importantly maybe the people around them, had to fundamentally rewrite the political DNA of the empire to effectively face new conditions. That, I think, is the not-so-secret answer to why the Roman Empire came back together at those 2 prior points and failed to do so in the 5th century. It's not so much about lacking an Augustus or a Diocletian, though that probably would have helped, as the fact that dire circumstances required both a strong hand on the helm and a real vision for how to transform the empire to face what it now faced. I hinted at this back in episode 15 on the end of the Roman political system. Following the arguments of a fine historian named Megan McAvoy, I mentioned that the system was actually undergoing a transformation in the 5th century. The active military emperors of the late 3rd and 4th centuries, from Diocletian to Theodosius, were replaced by either children or adult incompetents. Their role was mostly ceremonial, and court officials and especially generals did the real business of ruling. The historian Guy Housel, one of my favorites, called the period from 410 to 455 the triumph of the generals, and I think that's about right. On the face of it, there's no reason why this couldn't have worked. What we're talking about when we boil it down is effectively a depersonalized form of rule, where the bureaucracy and military kept on chugging regardless of who was in charge. As long as there were competent administrators in charge of the civil administration and the army, it didn't really matter all that much who the emperor was. This is more or less what ended up happening in early modern Europe with the growth of the fiscal military state, though even their rulership still mattered some. The administrative states in which all of us live today are built like this, as conglomerations of systems and structures that move largely of their own accord. No matter who the president is, at least in theory, the IRS still collects taxes, park rangers go to work, soldiers still get up in the morning and do their PT, and Social Security checks still get mailed. So why didn't this work in the 5th century? I'd say there are a few reasons. First, we shouldn't understate the importance of sheer bad luck. A military defeat here, an untimely death there, and so on. The Vandals, Alans, and Sueves managing to slip past the usurper Constantine III to reach Spain in 409 is a good example of this. We might say the same about the razor-thin defeat suffered by a combined Visigothic and imperial army in trying to deal with the Vandals a decade later. If they'd won, there probably wouldn't have been a Vandal invasion of Africa, and things would look much, much different. We can only put so much weight on luck, though. On a basic level, that kind of system, this depersonalized system, was built around the imperial court and a bureaucratized military and administration that was vulnerable to intrigue and fighting at the top. It was about who got to control access to the emperor, the figurehead from whom all of those other top officials derived their legitimacy and their power. Generals rose and fell all the time, from Stilicho in 408 to Aetius in 454. And the same was true of the other top court officials who competed to be the power behind the throne. Moreover, to maintain their own power and authority, those top officials might make trade-offs that sacrificed the authority and power of the political system itself. In other words, the incentive structures might run in opposing directions. Third, the granting of power to generals left a lot of open space in the system. Armies and their leaders got a ton of leverage. This was the gap into which Alaric and the Visigoths slipped in the early 400s, and it's how they ended up negotiating with the central government for their own settlement in Aquitaine. Rivalries and trade-offs were a necessity, and because trained soldiers were at a premium, generals were loath to destroy each other in open battles. They would rather join forces or kill the general and absorb his troops. Finally, political systems like this need some measure of stability or predictability if they're going to be controlled by generals and court officials. Dynastic succession within a family of generals or court officials is one option. That's kind of what became the case with the shoguns in Japan, the Frankish mayors of the palace in the early Middle Ages, the ones who went on to become the Carolingian dynasty. But nothing like this developed in the last days of the Roman Empire. These ruling generals could come from anywhere. They could play off multiple sources of legitimacy and power, which made it hard to predict where the next one was going to come from, who to hitch your wagon to. So in other words, there were deep structural problems built into this new potential order from the get-go. It's not entirely surprising that it failed to develop into a coherent and stable system. Rival generals competing for the control of the imperial core offered nothing to provincials, either lowborn or elites, in the outlying provinces. What did provincials in Britain or northern Gaul care who the power behind the throne happened to be? If the generals weren't capable of protecting the frontiers, guaranteeing some measure of competent, stable leadership, they'd look elsewhere for protection and predictability. That's exactly what happened. I've always been struck by how little local resistance there was to barbarian takeovers. Maybe, as we've discussed in past episodes, that's just because we don't have the sources that would tell us about it. It's also possible that the sheer threat of armed force from barbarian armies did most of the work in this regard. The latter is certainly possible, I don't discount it. But from what we can tell, each of these new barbarian kingdoms worked hard to sell its rule to at least the local elites, if not more broadly than that, and those people seemed to have bought what the barbarian kings were selling. Roman aristocrats manned the bureaucracies of these new kingdoms, from Aquitaine to Italy to North Africa. They collected taxes, they wrote administrative letters, they served as diplomats. In other words, Romans were willing participants in the successor kingdom's governance. They weren't sitting around pining for an old imperial order that wasn't coming back. Most importantly, These Romans did all this from very early on in the existence of these kingdoms, which says to me that they wanted to be a part of the hierarchy and the power structure. By its very nature, a central government run by generals and bureaucrats at an imperial court in distant Italy didn't have much to offer the blue bloods of Lyon, Tarragona, or Toulouse, much less the local strongmen of by now distant Gallia Belgica in the far north or Britain. The barbarian kingdoms, on the other hand, they offered a meaningful alternative. Regional aristocrats took up that offer. It's not entirely surprising. When they did that, and the central government, so beset by infighting, finally fell apart, it was as good as over. So, again, if we're spitballing here, when exactly was the point of no return? Some would point to the establishment of the Visigoths in Aquitaine in 418, but I don't buy that. They didn't really start acting independently for a decade. That was more a symptom of imperial malaise than a cause, I think. The loss of Britain, and more so northern Gaul around that point, mattered, but they were strategic outposts rather than core provinces. I think the real hammer blow was the loss of North Africa, and especially Carthage in 439. Regardless of the evolution of the political structures of the empire in the West, it needed taxes to function, and North Africa was the heart and soul of the complex, unwieldy tax system that Diocletian had put in place. When it became clear that the empire wasn't going to recover North Africa from the Vandals, despite several attempts, the last of them in 468, it was as good as over. Even so, things might still have worked out with a little luck or a few respites from the seemingly constant problems of the 5th century. The eastern half of the empire, after all, managed to make it through its rough times, though not unscathed. It was undergoing a lot of the same structural issues, including child or incompetent emperors, the presence of barbarian armies, and consistent raids from across the frontiers. Attila, after all, nearly ruined them. He devoted more time in his early career to raiding the east than he did the west. An assassination here, a charismatic usurping general there, a competent Persian king on that side, the east might have ended up just like the west. It wasn't a given that the east was going to survive, just as it wasn't a given that the west would fall. It wasn't a given that either would make it past that inflection point in the 5th century. Luck, the right emperors at the right time, and a stronger core of productive, wealthy territory was probably the difference. We'll talk about that at length in the future. So the Roman Empire had been transformed in major ways, at least twice before the 5th century. The sheer resilience of the empire is hard to overstate. To paraphrase one of my old professors, Clifford Ando, what requires explanation isn't so much that the empire failed, as that it lasted so long in the first place. Ando gives a great explanation of this in his book Imperial Ideology and Provincial Loyalty in the Roman Empire. He basically argues that imperial propaganda, built around the person of the emperor, is what convinced people to buy into the system. I totally agree with his conclusions there. I don't think that's wrong at all. But on an even more basic level, what really stands out is how adaptable the basic framework of the Roman Empire proved to be. The ideology changed over time, the form of central government changed dramatically, the administration was totally reworked, but there was enough flexibility built into the system to accommodate even drastic change. And at the end of the day, that was the genius of the Roman Empire. It offered citizenship as a package of legal rights rather than something tied into immutable ethnic identity, even to freed slaves. The army was open to immigrants from across the frontiers. The central government found new and innovative ways over the course of its history, from the 2nd century BC all the way up into the 4th century, of binding local elites into webs of power. It found ways of co-opting them, of bringing them into the system as a whole, rather than imposing rule.